So give me one moment. Can people see the things I'm holding up? I'm seeing some nodding, fantastic. So I'm a little bit old school. I'm not going to do too much screen sharing, but I am going to show you some things. Give me 1 second. Okay, fantastic. You'll hopefully see the first thing that I'm holding up is this very plain, quite small grey book with this very elaborate German title, Das Buch Namen. And for any German speakers out there, this is Shemot, the book of names, the book of Exodus. And I'll show you its spine as well. And you can see that this wonderful kind of very ancient looking script continues on the spine. And if I open it up, if people can still see, we have these very plain but sort of beautifully designed title pages. Okay, and we can see that it says Das Schrift, the Wunderdeutschen von Martin Buber, gemeinsam mit Franz Rosenzweig. And if you'll excuse my terrible German pronunciation, you can see that this is part of a translation of the Bible by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig. Now, partly, well, why is this interesting? Why is a German version of the Bible interesting? So partly, I think it's very beautiful. If we have a look, I've got 2 volumes. I've got Genesis and I've got Exodus. You can see this is Genesis, das Buch im Anfang, in the beginning. And if we go to the beginning, you can see again this beautiful, very sparse typography. And one of the first things that you might notice is there's no Hebrew. There's just lots and lots of German. And I think if people have heard of Martin Buber and heard of Franz Rosenzweig, they were very important philosophers in late 19th and early 20th century Judaism. And they really had a vision. This was published in Berlin in 1929. If you think about things going on in Germany in 1929, that interwar period with mass inflation and unemployment and the world kind of falling apart, these 2 guys decided that the most important thing they could do, one of them, was to translate make a new translation of the Bible into German so people could understand it. And they described they knew that Jews in particular felt very close to the Bible. They really wanted to, they knew it was part of our heritage and that we felt it's ours, it's a possession. But what they described that they want to do is they want to turn it into a storm. This amazing idea of this powerful new entity to kind of wake people up and shake them. And so they looked for a new kind of language. And I think what they do in their beautiful, in the typography and the covers, they take what's very old and they turn it into something new, this modern format, this accessible way. So if we look even more closely, I think we'll see some more interesting things about this book. So one, it's a very important German translation of the Bible. But if we look closely, we see not only the title and the cover, but this copy has an R on the bottom. Now, R is unusual in German and R is unusual in libraries as well. But it indicates that this book has been somewhere. And what's a little bit surprising, if I open up this copy again, is to see a marking like this. And hopefully, well, people can see there is an eagle, and the eagle is holding a wreath, and inside that wreath, there is a swastika. And in that library stamp, it reads, do you want me to put headphones? Reich Institut für Geschichte des Neuen Deutschlands. And what that tells us, that this particular copy in this book was at some point in the Reich Institute library. So what was the Reich Institute für Geschichte des Neuen Deutschlands? It was an instrument of the Nazi regime. They had two goals, which are perhaps opposed. One was a propaganda role to remove Jews from German history. And one was to save elements of Jewish culture for a time when they thought that Jews would no longer exist. That glorious Reich that they imagined. And what they did is they went around stealing books like this, or from Jewish libraries, from individuals, and looting them, basically. But they were very meticulous. They stamped everything that came into their library with an ownership stamp. They marked it, they filed it. Thankfully, they weren't successful in their goals. And what happened at the end of the war, as these Nazi institutions were abandoned, was that these books were saved and they traveled to a different location. And they were gathered together by the Allies and principally the American army at a place called the Offenbach Archival Depot. And there again, we can trace their journey because there again, they were stamped. And you can hopefully see the mark much plainer. We don't have that German black letter script anymore. We have a very sort of common sense American, no nonsense, simple circle with Offenbacher Mann written inside it. And we can trace another stage in the journey of these books. So I think if we imagine the journey that these books have taken, they're published in Berlin in 1929 in a visionary effort to make something new in Judaism, to use the German language to allow Jews to take ownership again of their texts. And then this particular copy, this particular set, I don't know exactly how, but I would imagine were, rather than being bought for the Reich Institute Library, were probably stolen. And then at the end of the war, the Americans tried to save as much of the Jewish culture that's been taken by the Nazis as possible. So what happens then, and where does Leo Baeck Library come in? After the war, they tried to find homes for Jewish artifacts that have been looted. And the beginnings of Leo Baeck College Library are 200 books that came from the Offenbach Archival Depot to London through the Society for Jewish Study. And they formed the nucleus of the Leo Baeck College Library when the library began in 1956 with the birth of the college. And I think it's very powerful for me to, and I hope for all of you, to be able to be at the next part of this story. And I think for me, there's a strong parallel with Leo Baeck College itself, who the first generation of teachers, of rabbis, were people who, many of whom had survived the Holocaust and were trying to rebuild Jewish life, to create a living Judaism after the wake of that tragedy and that trauma. And I think that carries on in what the students who are coming out of the college and into the rabbinate today are trying to do, to make a Judaism that speaks to us today, that looks to our heritage, and takes that forward to create something new. There's an idea that the world is constantly in creation. And I think we do the same thing with our Judaism. Whatever trauma the Jewish people suffer, we go on to recreate and to start anew. And for me, these books, and particularly for me as a librarian, with their stamps, with the Nazi stamps, the American stamps, and the last stamp to show you is the Leo Baeck College stamp, is a very powerful thing to hold in my hands, and to be able to share with you and to be able to share with other people that come into the library. So I hope that gives you a sense of a little bit of the history and the starting place for our collections. I wanted to share with you another Bible, and it happens to be another German Bible. This is the Philipson Bible. This time it's much bigger. You can, hopefully my hands give you a sense of the size of things. And it's a little bit grander. It's got some gold lettering on the spine and a beautiful embossed design on the top. And this, if I open it up, was published in Leipzig in 1849. And it's very, very large. So I'm going to try and show you the title page. And it's an Israelitische Bibel. And it was translated by Ludwig Philippson. It's known as the Philippson Bible. And people often refer to him as a Reform rabbi. He said, I'm neither a Reform rabbi or an Orthodox rabbi. If you want to call me something, call me a historically minded Jew. But he was certainly a reformer, and he had lots of really interesting ideas. And there are a couple of interesting things about this Bible in particular. One is that it has his commentary, and his commentary, I'm losing my place. Oh, this is a nice page to show you. Here we go. So you can see the Hebrew at the top, and then lots of German down below. And in his commentary, he drew on Jewish sources and Christian sources and archaeology and Egyptology, and he was very, very broad. He had this very German kind of scientific approach, and he was criticized by some of his Orthodox colleagues for the type of commentary he was producing, but he persevered nonetheless, and he had a similar goal to Buber and Rosenzweig 60, 80 years later, in trying to make a German version that spoke to Jews of the day. And a lot of Jews at that time in Germany in the mid-19th century and later used Luther's translation of the Bible into German, which is not sympathetic to Jewish interpretations, let's say. The other thing that I find absolutely wonderful about this particular Bible was that he uses illustrations. And you can see here, this is in the book of Psalms, and you have some deer running around. And he uses illustrations that reflect his interest in the historical reality of the Bible and the teaching and learning going around in the universities at that time. So the book of Psalms, as well as having deer to illustrate, have these wonderful harp illustrations, all different kinds of harps, people playing the harp. And it gives, I think, rather than trying to not always show what the text is saying, but to bring a dimension of study to the experience. Often images are included for people who can't read or can't read the language or don't read the language. And I think here he's trying to provide something for different levels of experience and understanding, but also to show the historical context, and that perhaps that these texts don't exist in isolation. He also, I think it's the page before, has a wonderful image. He was a great Egyptologist and has a wonderful image, if people can see at the bottom there, of Egyptian musicians. And this, again, this idea that the Psalms, which are such important music and poetry in Judaism, are part of this wonderful praising of God through music and ideas that is shared amongst many cultures, but has particularities. When did he die? When did he die? He died the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm. So did he know Buber and people like that?
So there's some overlap, but he's sort of really, I think, sort of philosophically the generation before. So kind of contemporary with Geiger more than Buber and Rosenzweig.
Thank you.
No problem. One of the very poignant illustrations is of the book of Lamentations, and we're coming up to Eicher, and we're coming up to Tish B'Av, when some people will read that book. And if people can see how they illustrate the Jerusalem left bereft is actually with Athens destroyed. So it's actually an image from classical history rather than Jewish history or religious history, but somehow for him that speaks to the disaster and that sense of ruin and loss, which I think these engravings convey very, very movingly. One of the things I particularly like is the illustrations for the Song of Songs, and anyone familiar with the Song of Songs will know it's rich with images of the natural world and of herbs and spices. And one of the things he does in the illustrations that are used is he provides botanical drawings. So again, you know, you might never have seen myrrh, but he gives you a drawing to illustrate the herb and the spice being referred to. So I think to aid the imagination in some of these beautiful lyric poems. One of the things that I just thought was lovely, and I think that probably the last illustration I'll share with you is from the Book of Chronicles, towards the end of the Bible. He has this wonderful illustration here of different kinds of headdress, and he points out an Arab and an Israelite headdress. And I think it's such a sort of beautiful, beautiful detail. And this is the mid-19th century, and you really have this period of people visiting the Holy Land, visiting Jerusalem, visiting the land, and coming back with drawings and images of the people, how they were then. So it's slightly anachronistic at the same time. This probably isn't really ancient dress, but is reflecting of this very romantic sort of Enlightenment view. So those are two Bibles, two heavy books, and I think the next thing I wanted to really, before I show you, I'll tell you the story behind it. Our rabbinical students deal very deeply with the Bible, with the Talmud, and also with liturgy, with the prayer books. And one day, the library doesn't only serve students. And one day, a regular library user who's a bit of an expert in Anglo Jewry, a maven, if you will, and he has his own wonderful library. And when he comes to Leo Baeck Library, I know that he really needs something if he doesn't have it. And he had been asked to, he was the consultant on a film being made about 19th century, it was a fictional film set amongst the Jewish community in Russia in the 19th century. And he comes into the library and he says, "Cassy, is there a blessing for the Tsar?" And I thought, hang on, I'm in Fiddler on the Roof. And anyone who knows that famous scene where the people of Anatevka ask the rabbi, is there a blessing for the Tsar? And he says, "May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." So I was quickly transported back to Finchley, and he explained that he was really looking for any examples of what we more commonly call the prayer for the state. If there were any more examples that he could use, because it would help what this film was trying to do. So we had a look, and lo and behold, we found a blessing for the Tsar. And this is actually, it's not from a Siddur, it happened to be, the first one we found was from a Yom Kippur Machzor, and I can show you, it's got a lovely title page. And it's published in 1899, I think, 1891, in a place called Pietrikov, which is somewhere in Belarus. And we discovered that, and you can see at the top, hopefully, this is Haftorah. Sorry, it's difficult to hold it and read it out at the same time. Haftorah L'Shacharit Yom Kippur. So just after the Torah reading, when you would normally say the prayer for the state, we have just in this paragraph here, we have the prayer for the state. And I don't know if people can see, I'll hold it as close as I can, in slightly bold letters.
Yeah.
You have Alexander Alexandrovich and Maria Teodoreva, and also their son Nicholas Alexander. And it's written in, so it's the bold letters of the Hebrew script in that middle paragraph. And I I think it's just extraordinary. And I'm aware, as I'm telling you about this and as I'm holding it up, that I'm in Leo Baeck Library every day. So picking up books that are 100 years old, 150 years old. This one is 91.8, 128 years old, like this one. I probably take it a little bit for granted, but it is quite spectacular to think of the people who've used it, the journey that it's been on. And just that, you know, here are the names of the Tsar and the Tsarina, just like we have, and this is my Yom Kippur Machzor. It's a Routledge one, the sort of the traditional one. And just to show you, you know, I'm sure people are familiar with this and familiar from the Reform Prayer book as well, that here you have exactly the same wording. And this is for Elizabeth, our Queen. And that sort of sense of continuity. And one of the reasons why we have such a wonderful prayer book collection at Leo Baeck College is because partly our rabbis, are engaged with the study of liturgy, but one of the projects that they do, which I always find so fascinating, is they are tasked with tracing the development of a particular prayer through the development of the prayer book. And I think you can see how having historical texts like this really enrich that process. You can see not only what was happening 128 years ago, but what was happening in Russia, in Sephardi communities in France, in North Africa, and across the denominations. What I love about the library is also the wealth not only of liturgy, but of commentary, of response to literature, of rabbinic literature across traditional communities and all manner of progressive communities. It makes for a wonderful richness to see that breadth of Jewish life. I'll share with you another prayer book, and I think this might be a little bit familiar to members of EHRS. It's the Reform Forms of Prayer Siddur from the 2008 edition, so not the sparkly new red or light blue one, but the slightly older one. And this actually belonged, if you can see a little photo there, to the late Rabbi Sheila Schulman, who I think some of you will know. For those who don't or who didn't, she was a formidable figure. She was a New Yorker. She became a rabbi late in life. She was, I don't think she would mind me even now saying, a radical feminist, a challenger to the status quo. And she not only, she was one of the first gay women rabbis ordained at Leo Baeck, along with Eli Tikva and really inspired generations of people to become rabbis. And this was her siddur. And she, when she taught at the college, and when she passed away, a lot of her books came to the college. And she was a famous, she wasn't really an annotator, but she was a post-it note user. And her books are littered with post-it notes, and there's a fascinating PhD to be written if anyone wants to on what she marked and what she didn't mark. But what's wonderful about her siddur is that she did write in it and she did annotate. And it's wonderful, I think, for a few reasons. I think partly because you can see, I'll show you a page, I could probably choose any page, but you can see her post-it notes and her markings saying when to stand, when to sit down, what page to turn to, whether to read it in English, whether to read it in Hebrew. And I think it's wonderful to trace the sort of performative element of being a rabbi. I know your rabbis, EHRS, are wonderful, and you never think they have to prepare for a second to lead a service or anything like that. But there is a little bit of theatre.
We prepared very, very carefully, I'll have you know.
I'm sure. But I think it's wonderful to see, and I often think for our kind of students who are starting out on their rabbinic journey, to see the work that does go in, and how you do have to plan and how you learn. And it's one of the great privileges I have being part of the LBC community, of seeing those skills develop. One of the other lovely things you see in Sheila's siddur, and here you have different versions of the priestly blessing. And you can see, I hope, she's actually got a German version, she's got versions in the plural, she's got changes in translation. And I think here you start to see not only a reflection of some of the trends in synagogue practice, I suppose, but also her own theology, places where she's changed a male gender language of God to a gender neutral version or a female version, and some of those ideas coming through. There's something incredibly intimate, not only about seeing someone's annotations, reading where they've read, but I think about holding that book in your hand. And one of the wonderful things about Leo Baeck Library in particular is that we have the books of many illustrious and beloved rabbis and teachers, Sheila Schulman, Leo Baeck himself, our namesake, Rabbi Albert Friedlander, Rabbi Harry Jacobi, who passed away last year. Lots of people who have been teachers and influencers in life, and the library remains a place where I think, I spoke about at the beginning about the library being about people and books and people and people, and it for me very movingly is a place also where we can connect with the voices of the past and people that we have loved, either through the text that they have written and the text that they have read. And for me, I knew Sheila when I was a little girl, and to think that this is the book that she governed from and she led from, I think is very moving, and I think is a really important part for our rabbinic students to feel connected to the community of rabbis as well as the community of Jews going back into time. So 2:30, okay. Okay, so our students work very hard, and one of the things that they're very concerned with and the focus of their studies are rabbinic texts. And one of my favorite moments last year in the library was where one of our students was sort of just standing in the middle of the library reading a book, and he looks up, and I think he was a student who was sponsored by the liberal movement, and he looks up and he sees a Masorti rabbi, a practicing rabbi, and he goes up to him and he says, "How would you translate this?" And he was referring to a line from the Song of the Sea from the book of Exodus, and it's probably familiar to many people because we use it in the liturgy as well. Uzi v'zimrat yah v'yehili lishua. The Lord is my strength and my might, he has become my salvation. And the student says, "How would you translate this? Isn't this the basis of your theology?" And they start having this conversation. And a lecturer, one of the LBC faculty who's on the other side of the library, is listening, and they go over and the three of them are having conversation, and this continues, and they start pulling books off the shelf. For me, this was just a wonderful, exactly what libraries are supposed to do, supposed to bring people who care about ideas together to be able to stimulate each other and bounce off each other. And what they started to do was they started to go to the shelves and pull down commentaries. So while they were talking amongst themselves with their own ideas, they were also referring to the ideas of rabbis and thinkers and Jewish scholars who had come in generations before. And one of the texts that they were putting down, and which I thought it would be lovely to share with you, are commentaries called Mikra Godolot. It's a Hebrew expression which means sort of the big book of the Bible. And normally what it is, it's something like this one, where you have, hang on one second, where you have the Torah text over here, so the original Hebrew text, and then you have commentaries scattered around, as well as translations into Aramaic and sometimes other languages. So each of these different paragraphs that you can see are a different commentator. And you might also be able to identify, if I hold it close enough, you have the regular sort of block Hebrew script that lots of us will be familiar with, but you have this different font, this different typeface, which is known as Rashi script, which is a bit of a misnomer. But it's to sort of demarcate that these are the commentaries, and this is the real thing. And I don't know if people can see, these are the names of the commentators. So here we do have Rashi himself, and here we have, it's difficult to read upside down. This is Ibn Ezra, the Orach Chaim, so the different names of commentators. This particular copy, I think, is from the late 19th century, and I thought I would just show you also its wonderful title page, which, if people can see, we have Moses at the top with his the the light shining off his head in a slightly formidable way. And then we have these fantastic cherubim flanking the title, Mikrot Gedolot. And what books like this do on the next page is they list all the different commentaries. So it tells you that this is the book of Shemot, of Exodus, and then all these different people here are the illustrious commentators who are going to commentate of the text. Now, I often find this a bit terrifying. I'm a native English speaker, and thankfully, the Jewish Publications Society, who are a wonderful Jewish publisher based in the States, have put together something called the Commentators Bible, which is this big book. And what they've done is they've brought, they've done the same thing, but they've done it in translation. So if I open up, the page looks similar, where you have, if people can see, you have the Hebrew text, and then all around it you have the wonderful commentaries from thousands of years of Jewish thought, but this time in English and nicely laid out and an accessible format. Because not only are our students who have a rigorous linguistic training, I think at Leo Baeck it's fair to say, coming to study, but our doors are open to people. If you are, giving a Devar Torah or talking or studying, you'll get in touch with me. You are very welcome to come and use the library, and we'll try and connect you to English texts. So I said that our students work hard. I think they really do, and I think one of the challenges that they have is that their rabbinic studies are shaped around academic qualifications. So not only are they doing placements with synagogues and learning pastoral care and writing sermons and learning how to lead services, but they do a lot of rigorous academia as well, that culminates in these days in what's called an MA in applied rabbinics. And I hope that Mark or Debbie won't mind, but one of the wonderful collections we have in the library is we have all the dissertations that our rabbinic students have written for the last almost 65 years. And I was thinking, I realized that most of your rabbis are, if not all of them, are graduates of Leo Baeck. And I just thought I would very briefly share with you both the physical objects, because they're wonderful, and a little sense of the study that your rabbis did, because I think it's a wonderful thing to see. This one, was by Stephen Katz in 1970 something. And partly what's wonderful is you can see it's beautifully typewritten, and it is a study of interpretations of biblical narrative, women in the book of Genesis. So if you want to ask him questions about that. And in his preface, he thanks his teachers, and he talks about his wonderful experience studying, and the last thing he does is he thanks the lady who typed up the dissertation, Mrs. Ziegler, for history. And I think it's very beautiful. I have also Rabbi Marx from 1996, who was writing about caveat vendor, the Jewish law concerning the sale of defective goods in the context of the Jewish law of sale. And again, his preface is very moving, and the way people take this opportunity, because the dissertation, I think, is becomes a big part of people's rabbinate. They really, it's the biggest opportunity to think through an idea and where that's going to take you in your leadership and your congregational support. And finally, I do have Rabbi Debbie's, who was writing about rabbinical authority, women's bodies, from management to transformation in the understanding and use of Niddah. And again, what's lovely about Debbie's in particular is that she thanks her librarian. I didn't have the privilege to be at Leo Baeck then, but Annette Bockler, who one of my illustrious predecessors, is mentioned there. I think one of the things that really struck me is partly you can see the movement through time from the typography, from typewriter to word processor, but also I think there's something about the college and how we start off with Rabbi Katz in the 70s thinking about Torah and then Rabbi Mark thinking more about Talmud and Halacha, and Rabbi Debbie this idea that's very current now of applied rabbinics, of the kind of practical yet profound decisions and ideas that we're thinking about to renew our Judaism. So you have some illustrious thinkers amongst your leadership. So what do people do in the library? They talk to each other, they read books, they sleep. Oh my goodness, I've learned the quiet art of waking somebody up without touching them. They pray. We have amongst our students, people who find a quiet corner and, you will see shocheling, and they steal things. Practicing rabbis, when they meet me, love to tell me what they've stolen from the library. I would really like to end this practice. And if it wasn't for lockdown, we were going to have an amnesty, a book amnesty, where people could bring their books back. But then lockdown happened, and like everything, life changed a lot. But the other thing that happened that people do is they sing. Sometimes in preparation for a service, sometimes just enjoy, and mostly it's wonderful. Maybe not always, but mostly it's wonderful. And I think the reason I mention it is because it sits very nicely with a really important part of the collection, which is music. So not only books about the history of Jewish music and ideas behind Jewish music and liturgy particularly, and learning to read from the Torah and those kind of things, but also sheet music in the history. And I thought I would share some interesting things that, again, a little bit like the dissertation, sort of show a bit of the development through time. So one of the first things I wanted to show you is what's known as the Blue Book. And anyone involved with sort of synagogue music will probably have come across it. The voice of prayer and praise. And this, I suppose, is a more traditional United Synagogue collection. As they describe it as being a handbook of synagogue music for congregational singing. And this one is from 1933. I think it was originally published, this is the 3rd edition, so kind of turn of the century. And what I thought I would show you, and if there are people who can read, who can sight read music, you have, just to give you a sense, we have Yigdal, 2 versions of Yigdal, Yigdal number 1, Yigdal number 2. And down here at the bottom, response to Baruch Hu. So the part in the service where we get ready to praise God just before the Shema, this is one of the tunes. And you also have responses to Kaddish. So this is one of my favorite things is how, I don't know if people can see, is how the very familiar Hebrew has been transliterated to reflect a sort of Anglo-Jewish pronunciation. So that's the voice of prayer and praise. I think much older, and again, one of my little thrills is that this book says Music Volume 1, the property of the West London Synagogue. I think I would say that's the property of Leo Baeck Library now, but don't tell anyone at West London that I have it. And there, if anyone has been to services at West London, they famously have their choir. And this is a collection of their tunes in 4-part harmony, edited, you can see at the bottom, by Charles Garland Verinder, who was their first choir master. And you can see, I'll show you, hopefully I'll be able to hold this up. If I do it like that, at the top it says minister, and the minister will say, people can see that, Baruch Hu Hashem, etc. And then the choir will respond in 4-part harmony as it is written. And which takes us, and I think some people will probably be familiar with this. This is Shir HaTefillah, songs of prayer, music to accompany the Reform Siddur. And this is the modern day, the late 20th century version of the same thing. And what's wonderful is to see how similar and how different these books are, because if I show you here, we have three different tunes for Baruch Hu, for the same piece of music. We have the page number that they refer to in the Siddur, which you also have in the other two, and you have some information about who wrote them and where they came from. And I think that it's, again, wonderful to see, particularly through Anglo Jewry, that thread of how important music is, and that we want to develop musical ideas. And I'll share with you, if I can reach it. So I mentioned Charles Garland Verinder, who was the choir master and I think organist, I'll check, at West London Synagogue. And he wasn't Jewish, which is quite interesting. And he wrote a few pieces, including this, Israela Cantata. And partly, I just think it's the most beautiful book. It has the most wonderful marbled pages. It's also huge. And that's its fantastic, very Victorian title page. Israel in Adversity and Deliverance, a sacred cantata in 2 parts with overture and intermezzo, composed and dedicated to his friend, the Reverend, by Charles Garland Verinder, published by Ivan Novello Books. And what's very nice about this, I did mark a place, but it's a wonderful sort of story and riff on tales from the prophets and visions from Isaiah. But also what's lovely about this particular copy is that, if I can carefully show you, it's signed by the man himself in 1887. If people can, the lighting is not fantastic. And one of the controversies going back to the roots of Reform Judaism in Germany and everywhere has always been mixed choirs. And I found a wonderful piece of commentary about Verinder, which tells us that, I'll just read it to you. It's from an article by Rachel Edelstein in Transactions, the Jewish Historical Society's magazine. And she says that when Verinder arrived, West London's choir consisted of men and boys. In 1863, Verinder introduced the idea of adding women to the choir, not because he supported any particular theological argument about the status of women in the synagogue, but because of the inconvenience that working with boy singers presented. He wrote to the synagogue council, "It is, however, our duty to bring again under your notice the occasional deficiencies in the execution of the choral music arising from the difficulties we experience in replacing those boys whose voices have become totally useless." So, again, the practical prompting the minhag a little bit there. So, just thinking. I'll maybe show you one more thing, and then if people have questions, they can ask me, or I can show you a couple more things if I've been talking for quite a long time, I realize. So the last thing I will formally show you is one of my favorite things from the library. And this is this very small book, and the eagle-eyed amongst you may be able to spot that this is not Hebrew, but in fact is Yiddish. But like in Hebrew, it's an English word, so it's very difficult to pronounce. And this little book is called Dentistic. And this tiny, tiny book was published in London in 1943 and is called Dentistic, Dentistry, an essay with quotations from the Talmud and practical directions for all. And the reason why I love it is because if you think about London in 1943 in the midst of war and the Blitz and everything else that's going on for everyone, not just the Jewish community, a Yiddish writer, has the passion to trawl through rabbinic literature and to share not only ideas about dentistry, about teeth and the theology of teeth, but to give you practical tips noch, so you too can do your wartime dentistry. And the fact that it survived, that this little book in slightly oddly punctuated Yiddish, it's maybe, I don't know, like 40, 50, I can tell you, 40 odd pages. To me, I think is a lucky thing. And again, speaks, for me, books are like people. They have their stories and their wanderings, and they have a story to tell as well as the texts that are inside them. So thank you very much for listening to me. You've been very patient with my juggling of books and the computer. But if anyone has any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer if I can.
You're not in the library at the moment, you're at home, is that right?
That is right. I am sadly not in the library at the moment. Like many places and many libraries, we are currently closed. We are hoping to reopen for our students at the beginning of term in September, and more widely when it is safe to do so. We're one of those wonderful library spaces where it's tiny, there are boxes and books everywhere, so we want to make sure that we're being safe and careful for everybody. But my heart, some things from the library are now in my home, but this is my home. What I'll do, I'll put my email address in the chat, and if anyone is interested in finding out more about the library or becoming a member or anything like that, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm still librarianing even though I'm out of the library, so I'll do that.
While Debbie sorts herself out at home, I can see that Lana and then Elise, or Elsie, depending on what the right way to pronounce you is, also had their hands up, and then David. So Lana, Elsie, and then David.
My family came from Amsterdam in about 16 something, after Oliver Cromwell's time, and I have this. It's back to front for me. Is it the right way for you?
Yes. It's the right. Yep.
It's a Dutch version of Genesis, and it's got a lovely bit. It's got a lovely bit with the prayer for the royal family of Holland.
Oh, that's just wonderful.
And it also has some of my family details written into it of births and deaths.
That's a very common practice.
Yes.
For people to record births, deaths, bar mitzvahs sometimes, and also if they change location. So if they were traveling around and they moved somewhere new. But that's so wonderful, and I think it's so exciting, and really this idea of how Jews interacted with the culture wherever they were. And printing a book is quite a significant endeavor, but really, really wonderful to see.
Is it the sort of thing that Leo Baeck would like when I pass it on, if Debbie doesn't want it?
We would certainly be interested.
That caveat.
We would certainly be interested. People are incredibly generous with donating books to us. One of our biggest problems is space. And I always have to say, if we have it already, we can't take it, and we're a wonderful library, so often we have it already, but certainly when it comes to prayer books, definitely people can get in touch with me and we can see if we have room for it, because particularly our prayer book collection, it's to be able to just go to the shelves and see that development and that that Jewish life really is
yes.
wonderful.
I know my father donated, or from my father's collection and library, I donated a lot of books in Russian relating to the Jews of Russia. But I also have an uncle's book from when he was in the British Army in Egypt, visiting, is it the Ben Sion synagogue? The synagogue in Cairo.
Oh wow, that sounds amazing.
Mm.
Oh well,
Okay.
I would love to see them.
Elsha had her hand up, and then David Bagon as well. And then I think we're probably going to be out of time.
Thank you, Cassy, for a wonderful talk and insight into how the library works. I just wonder, to what extent is the library based on Ashkenazi publications rather than Sephardic or Mizrahi?
I think there's definitely, and even more specific than Ashkenazi, there's a heavy German influence, because our founding collections came from donations and bequests of people who came from Germany, and often, who had saved their books and were German speakers. I think we do try and redress the balance, particularly we had a student recently who's of Moroccan descent who gave us some prayer books. We have faculty who are involved at Bevis Marks, and we try and have a little bit from everywhere. I was amazed at how many books we have about Jews of China, So I think, being totally frank, there's certainly an Ashkenazi bias, but there's definitely interest in halakha and certainly minhag, in law and practice from across the world and across the denominations.
Okay, thank you. There's one other question is, as you have a large music collection, are you interested in Dutch Chazanut, which was recorded in the 70s on CDs? All the different tropes, hundreds of them, thousands.
Wow. Elgie and I know each other, so I will talk to you all
You
after,
talk to me
after the
another
call.
time, okay.
I never realised this was...
David Baeck, do you still have a question?
Yes, my father had this Haggadah. I don't know if the library wants it. Can you see it?
Can't hear you.
Can you see this Haggadah?
Hang on a second.
Sefer HaAgadah.
Ah, Sefer HaAgadah. Is this Bialik and Revnitsky?
And if you look now, that's very expensive.
Odessa.
Odessa, yes.
Odessa.
So I'm going to play a game of Snap with you, David. 1 second. If people can see, this is the English translation of that book, I think. If it was published when I think it was in Odessa, Bialik, the famous Hebrew poet, and his publisher and editor Ravnitsky trawled through Jewish literature and made a selection because they were keen for people to be able to take a translation into the Hebrew that they were developing in the Hebrew language in its revival. So people could take their literary heritage. And it's wonderful to see. We also have a very early edition in the library, but there's an English translation which is beautifully published by Sachar in the 90s. But it's wonderful to see. And I think these things really speak to people, books that belong to our parents, our teachers. There's something incredibly moving about a tactile experience. That person might be gone, but you can touch the thing that they touched and you can share the reading experience. So thank you really to everyone for sharing their wonderful books with me. It's lovely to see it coming both ways.
I won a prize at university for an essay on modern Islam, and that's the book I bought with the prize. It was
fantastic.
The Bialik. One last question from Linda and Peter, and then we have to let Cassy get back to her life beyond Zoom. But this has just been fascinating. So Linda and Peter.
Sorry, just a quick one. I was involved with the college many years ago in the 70s or late 60s, and it was when it was at West London. But when you say you're at the in Finchley, I presume that's the Sternberg Centre. But whereabouts exactly within that complex are you?
So the college is based in the Manor House building, which is the main building. Anyone who's ever been there, big steps up to a grand black door with our wonderful listed staircase. And the college, lots of things happen on that site. Reform Judaism have their offices there. There are primary schools. There's the Masorti synagogue, and the library, as I mentioned at the beginning, is in the basement.
I see.
Because one of the very difficult things with libraries is that they're incredibly heavy. So if you want to be anywhere other than the ground floor or the basement, you have to have reinforced floors, which is the bane of every librarian's existence. But we are there.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Peter.
So an enormous thank you to Cassy. I knew this would be interesting, but I think that certainly has excelled my expectations of just stuff that we have in the Leo Baeck Library, and that Cassy is so brilliant at bringing to life. It was a very nice touch for you to bring our theses in as well, and a good reminder that we should always value our librarians, which I really do. So a huge thank you to Cassy, and I would encourage anyone who has a chance, once we are allowed, to go in and have a look around the library. There are some phenomenal medieval Talmud in the connection that are kept under temperature controlled rooms because they were, you know, they're so old and they're marked by the sensor, and all sorts of amazing pieces of history. And thank you, Cassy, for taking such wonderful care of them and bringing them to life for us today. Next Friday, our talk for the week is being hosted by Rabbi Emily, and she's going to be talking to Jackie McCrae, who is an EHRS member, who is head of speech and language therapy at the Nightingale Hospital, which is a critical part of how people, particularly in care homes, manage their recovery from COVID-19. So very, very different to this week, but absolutely fascinating too, I hope. Once again, thank you to Cassy and to all of you for joining us, and to the 10 or so people who are watching on the live stream. Thank you for being there too. Shabbat Shalom to everybody, and hope to see you very, very soon.
Thank you
and
very
thank
much.
You for getting home safely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much. Wonderful. Thank you.
So just with the finance manager, it would be useful to record students that overpay, so it's an easy way of tracking if the students that prepaid. But in theory, all payment information is available.
Cassy, thank you. That really was fabulous.
Was it all right, Debbie?
Really wonderful. And I'm sorry, just as I got home, I lost sound because I disconnected from the car audio and had to come back in again. But that was a much, much better way of sitting in gridlock than the first hour was.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that. I'm sorry that you were stranded, my goodness.
Really, that was, and so nice to see that actually our theses do occasionally leave the shelf, even if it's just to be shown.
Yeah, I thought, oh, I'll just have a look and see.
That was a really nice touch.
Well, you know, it helps to personalise it. Thanks, Mark.
Shabbat Shalom. That was really interesting. I was supposed to be doing other work, but I got too fascinated. So if nothing comes out of my mouth tomorrow morning at Shabbat, that's all your fault, Cassy.
You'll have to talk about the library.
Yeah, I will. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much for rescuing me, Mark.
Shall I turn this off now?
Sure.
All right. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Lovely to see you guys.
We'll see you soon, Cassy.
Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Debbie. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.